The Trump administration's war on gender identity has created an international diplomatic crisis that's forcing America's closest ally to issue formal warnings to its own citizens. Canada has just updated its U.S. travel advisory, cautioning citizens with X gender markers on their passports that they could face discrimination, scrutiny, and potential entry denials at American borders. This isn't just a domestic policy dispute anymore. It's become a full-blown international incident that's damaging America's relationships and making the country look petty and discriminatory on the world stage. So what exactly happened, and why is this Trump policy creating chaos that extends far beyond U.S. borders?
But a part of Donald Trump's message from the start has been trying to send Canadian jobs back to Whitmer's state.
We don't need their cars. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit.
Trying to force more businesses to build in the U.S. as central theme of why Trump keeps slapping more tariffs on different goods. The latest set to come into place on October 14th. A 25% tariff on cabinets and furniture, and a 10% tariff on lumber. That's on top of the other levies that already total 35% on Canadian softwood.
Having 45%, effectively tax on your exports to the U.S. is a significant burden.
The escalating tensions between the United States and Canada reflect a broader pattern of Trump's aggressive stance toward America's northern neighbor. His administration has been systematically targeting Canadian interests through punitive tariffs and economic pressure, attempting to reshape the relationship entirely. This hostile approach to diplomacy has set the stage for an even more contentious battle over human rights and identity. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to January 20th, 2025, Trump's first day back in office. Within hours of taking the oath, Trump signed Executive Order 14,168, titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. The order was sweeping in its scope and brutal in its language, declaring that the federal government would recognize only two sexes, male and female, and that these sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. The executive order immediately targeted passport applications, directing the State Department to suspend processing for anyone seeking to change their gender marker or requesting an X designation. This reversed years of progress made during the Biden administration, which had allowed non-binary, intersex, and gender nonconforming Americans to select X as their gender marker starting in 2022. The policy had been celebrated as a landmark victory for LGBTQ+ rights, finally allowing people to have government documents that reflected their lived reality. But Trump's order didn't just stop new applications, it created chaos for people who were already in the system. Americans who had submitted passport applications with gender changes found their documents suspended indefinitely. Some people had their old passports confiscated while their new ones were held up, leaving them unable to travel. Others received new passports with incorrect gender markers, forcing them to choose between having inaccurate documents or being unable to travel at all. The human cost of this policy became immediately apparent. Take the case of Louis, a 24-year-old transmasculine person who had legally changed his name and gender marker in New York State Court in December 2024. He submitted his passport application just hours after Trump took office, not knowing that his timing would trap him in bureaucratic limbo. Despite having updated his driver's license and social security card without any problems, his passport application was frozen. For months, he had no valid travel documents while the government sorted out its new discriminatory policies. Similar stories emerged across the country. Ebling, a 26-year-old in Washington, D.C., submitted his passport renewal with a gender marker change from female to male on January 15th. His application was received just after Trump's executive order took effect, and he was told by his congressional representative's office that passport applications with gender changes were being suspended indefinitely. He and his partner had to cancel travel plans, joining thousands of Americans whose lives were disrupted by Trump's ideological crusade. The policy was particularly devastating for intersex Americans, people born with genitalia, chromosomes, or reproductive organs that don't fit typical definitions for males or females. These individuals, who make up an estimated 1.7% of the population, found themselves caught in a bureaucratic nightmare. Many had mixed paperwork, with some documents reflecting their lived identity while their birth certificates remained unchanged. The Trump administration's policy forced them to navigate an impossible system where their very existence was being denied by their own government. But the Trump administration's overreach didn't go unchallenged. In February 2025, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of 7 transgender and non-binary Americans, arguing that the policy violated their constitutional rights. The case, Orr versus Trump, challenged the executive order as discriminatory and argued that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The legal challenge proved successful. In June 2025, U.S. District Judge Julia Kobik, a Biden appointee, issued a preliminary injunction blocking enforcement of the policy on a nationwide basis. Judge Kobik's ruling was scathing, noting that the executive order is candid in its rejection of the identity of an entire group, transgender Americans, who have always existed and have long been recognized in, among other fields, law and the medical profession. The judge recognized that passports aren't just used for international travel. They're required for opening bank accounts, renting cars, and countless other everyday activities. Forcing transgender and non-binary Americans to carry documents with incorrect gender markers would subject them to discrimination and harassment every time they needed to show identification. As Judge Kobik explained, these individuals would face anxiety, psychological distress, discrimination, harassment, or violence anytime they use their passports, not simply because they face these risks when using their passports for international travel. The Trump administration immediately appealed the decision, but suffered another defeat in September 2025 when the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit denied their request for emergency relief. The appeals court noted that the government had failed to engage meaningfully with the lower court's constitutional concerns, particularly regarding the Equal Protection Clause. Faced with these legal setbacks, the Trump administration has now taken its fight to the Supreme Court. In September 2025, Solicitor General D. John Sauer filed an emergency appeal asking the justices to allow enforcement of the discriminatory policy while legal challenges continue. The administration's argument reveals the true authoritarian nature of this policy. They claim that private citizens cannot force the government to use inaccurate sex designations on identification documents, and that passports are government property that should reflect the president's ideological preferences rather than the lived reality of American citizens. But while the legal battle continues in American courts, the international consequences of Trump's policy are becoming impossible to ignore. Canada's decision to issue a formal travel warning represents a diplomatic embarrassment for the United States. For the first time in recent memory, America's closest ally is warning its citizens that they might face discrimination when visiting the United States. Canada's travel advisory is carefully worded but unmistakably critical. The advisory states that federal systems in the U.S. are changing to no longer accept markers of gender identity. Sex assigned at birth may now be requested by federal forms and processes. It warns Canadian citizens with X gender markers that they might face entry restrictions in countries that do not recognize the X gender identifier, a direct reference to the United States discriminatory policy. The timing of Canada's advisory is particularly significant. While Canada has had general warnings about LGBTQ+ travel since 2022, the specific update regarding the United States was made on September 29, 2025. Just days after the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to intervene. This wasn't a coincidence. Canada was responding directly to the escalating discrimination coming from the Trump administration. Canada's position on this issue couldn't be more different from Trump's approach. Canada has allowed X gender markers on passports since 2019, and approximately 3,600 Canadian citizens currently use this designation. The Canadian government has made it clear that while it cannot guarantee entry to other countries, it stands behind its citizens' right to have accurate identity documents. This creates an awkward situation where Canada, a much smaller country, is taking a more progressive and humanitarian approach than its much larger neighbor. The international implications extend far beyond Canada. Around 15 countries currently recognize X or similar non-binary gender markers on passports, including Australia, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and others. Trump's policy puts the United States increasingly out of step with international norms and creates practical complications for international travelers from these countries. The policy also affects trusted traveler programs like Nexus, which allows expedited border crossings between the United States and Canada. In February 2025, following Trump's executive order, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection changed Nexus applications to eliminate the X gender option. This means that Canadians with X gender markers on their passports can no longer participate in the program, creating additional barriers to travel and commerce between the two countries. The broader context of this policy reveals the Trump administration's systematic attack on LGBTQ+ rights. The passport policy is just one part of a comprehensive effort to erase transgender and non-binary people from public life. The administration has also targeted transgender people in schools, healthcare, sports, and military service. This isn't about protecting women or promoting biological truth. It's about using government power to force LGBTQ+ Americans back into the closet. The economic implications of this policy are also becoming clear. LGBTQ+ Americans represent a significant economic force with an estimated purchasing power of over $1 trillion annually. By creating barriers to travel and subjecting LGBTQ+ people to discrimination, the Trump administration is potentially driving away tourism and business from both domestic and international LGBTQ+ travelers. Countries like Canada that take a more inclusive approach may benefit as LGBTQ+. Travelers choose destinations where they'll be treated with dignity and respect. The policy also undermines America's soft power and diplomatic influence. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as a global leader on human rights, often criticizing other countries for discriminating against minority groups. Trump's anti-LGBTQ+ policies make it much harder for America to credibly advocate for human rights abroad. When America's own allies are warning their citizens about potential discrimination in the United States, it severely damages America's reputation as a beacon of freedom and equality. The Trump administration's handling of this issue also reveals a stunning lack of competence in policy implementation. The executive order was issued without any consideration of the practical implications for people who were already in the passport application process. Thousands of Americans found themselves trapped in bureaucratic limbo, unable to travel because of poorly planned and hastily implemented discrimination. This kind of chaotic policy implementation has become a hallmark of Trump's governing style. But when it comes to people's fundamental rights and to travel, the stakes are particularly high. Looking ahead, the Supreme Court's decision on the Trump administration's emergency appeal will be crucial. If the court allows enforcement of the discriminatory policy, it will signal that the conservative majority is willing to prioritize ideological purity over constitutional rights and international relations. If the court maintains the injunction, it will be a significant victory for LGBTQ+ rights and a rebuke to the Trump administration's authoritarian overreach. But regardless of how the Supreme Court rules, the damage to America's international reputation may already be done.
And this was a long speech. Trump spoke for over 70 minutes. He made lots of turns throughout it. He discussed his ability at length to solve conflicts, including potentially the war in Gaza. He said if he is successful in ending that war, he believes he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, Arthi, as you mentioned, he took aim at Canada, once again resurfacing the 51st state comments, saying that if Canada wants to join the Golden Dome missile defense system, they should just join the U.S. And he also said that Canada had been struggling because of tariffs.
Trump's broader vision for American dominance, as he's made clear in recent speeches to military generals, involves projecting strength through confrontation rather than cooperation. His administration believes that America must be so powerful that no nation would dare challenge them, even on matters of basic human rights. This aggressive stance extends to all aspects of foreign policy, from trade wars with Canada to discriminatory policies that alienate allied nations. Canada's travel advisory represents a new low in U.S.-Canada relations, driven entirely by Trump's unnecessary and cruel targeting of LGBTQ+ Americans. The fact that America's closest ally feels compelled to warn its citizens about potential discrimination when visiting the United States is a damning indictment of the Trump administration's priorities. The passport controversy also highlights the broader pattern of the Trump administration's approach to governance, using federal power to target vulnerable minority groups while ignoring real policy challenges. While Americans struggle with healthcare costs, infrastructure decay, and economic inequality, the Trump administration is spending time and resources on a discriminatory policy that affects a tiny percentage of passport applications. It's a perfect example of the culture war politics that Trump uses to distract from his failures on substantive policy issues. For LGBTQ+ Americans and their allies, this controversy serves as a stark reminder of what's at stake in the fight for equality. The passport policy isn't just about travel documents, it's about the fundamental question of whether LGBTQ+ people will be recognized and treated as equal citizens in their own country. The Trump administration's answer is clear. They believe that transgender and non-binary Americans should be erased from official recognition and forced to live as second-class citizens. But the resistance to this policy also shows the strength of the LGBTQ+ rights movement and its allies. The successful legal challenges, the international criticism, and the ongoing advocacy efforts demonstrate that discriminatory policies will not go unchallenged. Organizations like the ACLU, Lambda Legal, and others are fighting back with every tool at their disposal, and they're winning important victories even against a hostile federal government. As this controversy continues to unfold, it's clear that Trump's passport purge has backfired spectacularly. What was intended as a symbolic victory for social conservatives has instead become an international embarrassment that damages America's relationships with its closest allies. Canada's travel warning is just the beginning. Other countries may follow suit if the Trump administration continues down this discriminatory path. The ultimate irony is that Trump's policy, supposedly designed to promote truth and protect women, is actually based on lies and hurts everyone. The policy ignores the scientific reality of gender identity and intersex conditions, forces people to carry inaccurate documents, and creates unnecessary barriers to travel and commerce. It's a perfect example of how ideological extremism leads to bad policy that makes everyone worse off. For now, the injunction remains in place, and Americans can continue to receive passports with accurate gender markers. But the fight is far from over, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The Supreme Court's decision will determine whether America continues to move toward greater equality and inclusion, or whether it retreats into the kind of state-sponsored discrimination that its allies are now warning their citizens about. The world is watching, and America's reputation hangs in the balance.